In the previous module, we examined whether the Bible can be taken as a historical witness and if it holds up to scientific rigor. We found that modern research continues to solidify the record that the Bible has kept for thousands of years.
There's still a lot of work to be done on the question of whether we can trust the Bible. For example, maybe it is a reliable witness to history, and we can even discuss some of the major criticisms about the understanding of science, but that still doesn't quite make it trustworthy yet. So I think it's important to discuss some other accusations, like whether changes have been made to the text over time.
Let's start with an obvious one. There are some claims that the Bible was written a really long time after the events took place, and that's how supernatural events got added in. So, Denise, when did the writing of the New Testament take place?
That's an excellent question. The Gospels were written 30 to 70 years after the time of Jesus. Before that, the Gospels were shared by what's known as the oral gospel tradition, in which the stories and teachings of Jesus were spread by word of mouth.
Why would the early church use the oral gospel tradition? Wouldn't it make more sense to write the stories down right after they happened?
Because literacy rates were very low and writing was extremely expensive, only the most educated in society wrote. Scholars widely agree that Mark was the first gospel, written down no more than 40 years after Jesus' death. Matthew and Luke used material from Mark as a basis for their writings, so they came shortly after Mark. John, however, did not use the Gospel of Mark and was the latest gospel written near the end of the first century. This causes some notable differences between John and the other three Gospels we have in the New Testament. For example, there are no parables recorded in the Gospel of John, but it does contain the greatest number of unique sayings of Jesus. The other books of the New Testament, namely the church letters that Paul and the other apostles were writing to the early church, began around AD 48. This puts them a few years before the first Gospel of Jesus was written. These apostles did not have a written record of Jesus' teaching and life, so this supports the claim that an oral gospel tradition was present in the early years. The last New Testament book was the book of Revelation, completed around AD 100, making the entire New Testament written between the dates AD 48 and 100, about 52 years.
This means the New Testament was written within a single lifetime of Jesus' ministry, and the church letters started just over a decade after Jesus' ministry. And as you said, we have it on pretty good authority that before writing, these accounts were shared by word of mouth. But how can we trust that the oral transmission was accurate?
A lot of skeptics believe that oral transmission is like a game of telephone, but the game of telephone was designed to be flawed. There's no accountability in the fidelity of the message, but Jewish oral tradition was designed to be extremely reliable for a couple of reasons. First, keep in mind that literacy rates were lower than today, so memorization was a much more prevalent skill. As an example of this, there were Jewish rabbis in the first century who could recite the entire Old Testament from memory. Second, the oral traditions were recited and shared publicly. So if this were a game of telephone, it would be the equivalent of every single person loudly and clearly reciting the message, then waiting for everyone around them to approve or reject its accuracy. That's more or less how the oral traditions were shared.
That's really helpful, Denise. A lot of people don't realize that this was really a systematic and organized way to teach historical facts. Given the circumstances they needed to overcome, oral traditions seems like a reasonable solution. And as you said, the oral tradition only lasted a few years before these events were written down.
So that explains how the New Testament was originally written, but not how we got the Bible today. The short answer is obviously that these books were copied, but can you explain why the copies of the Bible can be trusted?
You're right, the Bible was carefully copied over and over, but the technical term for these copies is manuscripts. Most of these copies were made in a clinical environment by trained professionals called scribes. They copied and translated manuscripts so people who spoke other languages could also have access to the Bible without a missionary present. The surviving New Testament manuscripts that we have are primarily in Greek, Latin, and Coptic. The more manuscripts you have, the more accurate your reconstructed book is. This is called textual criticism, and it's the process of taking lots and lots of versions of a written text and identifying any errors in them. We'll talk more about these errors in the next session. So here's the beauty of the biblical manuscripts. If you took classical writings such as the Iliad or the Odyssey and you compiled all their manuscripts and stacked them on top of each other, it would be about 4 feet tall. However, if you did the same for all the New Testament manuscripts we have, it would be nearly 6,000 feet tall, over 4 Empire State Buildings stacked on top of each other.
So you're saying we have many, many more times the number of manuscripts for the Bible than even the next most reliable ancient document?
Yes, we have way more copies of the Bible than any other ancient document in all of existence. So to recap, here's where we are. The events of the Bible were first shared through a very organized process of oral tradition, and this only lasted for a few years before writing took place. The entire New Testament was written within a single lifetime of Jesus, with the earliest books coming just shy of a decade after his death. The Bible was then carefully copied for the next 1,500 years, when the printing press was invented. We have so many copies, there is almost zero doubt about what was originally written. We'll talk more about these details in a later session.